I present to you today 3 repositories that I've been working on for cumulatively about 2 years. The first one is this front-end codebase repository. The second one is this D3v7 repository. And the third is this game repository. I think that this is on GitHub as image composition, and I haven't actually committed the game file, which is new. But let's just go through these repositories. The first one, front-end codebase, is available on GitHub at github.com/splashy/frontend-codebase. And it's accessible online at lore.land/button. You might notice that that's a bit different than this root directory, this root path, I should say, that has a select dropdown for 7 sites and a button that changes depending on the site that's chosen. When this codebase is deployed, we sniff out the domain and we choose the code path that aligns with what that domain is, in this case, lore. The other sites aren't live right now, but they have been, and I posted some YouTube videos on my main channel, I think a couple months ago. The second repository is for factshift.com, which is accessible at factshift.com or github.com/splashy/d3v7. This repository is about, I want to say, a month and a half old. And I started this mostly to describe a relationship to adding features instead of prioritizing codebase extendability. Extensibility? I'm not not actually sure what word to use. But with this, you have a few different options for features. Like, you can see me adding nodes, you can see me removing them. If I paste those back after refreshing the page, and you can see that all those nodes are there. You can do the same. You can clear the nodes. You can change to a different page. And there's a menu. Different options that have different keystroke combinations, etc. There are a lot of pretty cool options with this website, I think. And I can make some other videos about how this works specifically. That's different than lore.land/button, which only has a button. But this button also has a lot behind it. For one, it has Redux, it has React, it's using TypeScript, it uses Storybook, so you can see the different components. This is an example form that was generated from an object in JavaScript. So this is what I would consider to be a fully featured React codebase, because it also has Cypress tests. So Cypress tests for end-to-end testing. I think that there are 1 or 2 JavaScript unit tests, or React unit tests, and then Storybook to communicate the component architecture of this repository. That's contrasted with the D3v7 repository, which I just coded. I just wanted to get this idea out, and I've been consistently updating this whenever I came across a feature that didn't exist. So functionally, one of the main differences is that this repository is meant to scale across teams. If we look at the identities folder, and we can see that there are a bunch of different, or I guess a few main categories for features. These are the IDs of the features, as you can see here. Forms, these are the IDs of the forms that we have. These are all of the things that we use to create a form, or all of the ideas that we have created forms around. GraphQL has a list of queries, mutations. I'm pretty sure these are, I don't think that these are generated, but for each of the entity types, each of the main ones, we have all of the queries separated by the type of operation that we're running. And then routes, which just list the different things that you would have in navigation. One of the main things that I like about this is that with these IDs, we can find where specifically we're including that feature in the code base. And then, if we want to, we can use Cypress to check to see if this feature is being physically added to whichever page that we're on. So we can look for this data feature name and make sure that it matches exactly what the ID should be. We can target that with CSS to show or hide features that have been physically added to the page. We can also just go to wherever this is and delete this feature if we don't want to actually include it. In terms of white labeling for an application, we have lore.land mentioned, and I can just replace this string literally in the code base, and as a progressive web application, the code base will be ready to be installed with whatever name that we've chosen in the manifest. Now, I like this a lot. I like this approach a lot. Just for the sake of having all of the things that I would want as a software developer, they are here in a front-end code base. I'm able to add features and know that they're tested, know that at least I can check to see if they're on the page. If I want to, I can break down a feature into sub-features and check to see if those are included at certain times. And I can also do some more specific, page-specific testing to make sure that the things that I expect are at least accounted for. Now that's different than this D3v7 repository. As you can see, I just have it in my root scratch folder that I haven't changed since I added that. Originally, I was just playing around with D3, and then I started to add more and more features and figured this would actually be a pretty good home for factshift.com. I decided that on November 15th when I deployed to GitHub Pages. Eventually, I switched to Netlify because I wanted to do a few more specific things with routing. But as you can see, the structure here is a lot more freeform. This is under the assumption that the same cluster of features are going to be interdependent. We don't necessarily need a very specific breakdown of what features exist on which pages, because it's kind of assumed that we can mention them by IDs in the CSS, the style.css, which is a lot longer than I would want it to be. So just generally, this code base is meant to be more oriented towards fast development in the short term, and this code base is centered around sustained velocity for a team at scale over years. This is what I've learned after a decade of working on software at a variety of companies. I want to say like 6, 7 companies, 8 if you include freelancing. And I would say that both approaches have their place. When I'm on a job or when I'm working with clients, the thing that they want to see is how quickly I can add features. So this is kind of the approach that I would probably take to start with the understanding that I would want something like this front-end code base repository to at least be an option for the future. This code base answers all of the questions that I would have about where a project is, whereas this code base is accessible to people who haven't done a lot of development. It's relatively easy to look up these IDs in the code base. I'm pretty sure that I used query selector for this instead of get element by ID, for example, so I know that if I look for hashtag H1 input, or £, I should say, maybe Octothorpe, then I can find this ID in the code base and update the styles and use my IDE to make sure that it's highlighting the specific elements that I'm looking for. Whereas in this case, I need to know a little bit more about the lore to make sure that I can find where these features are mentioned. And just for example, I don't have an example of where in the CSS I can find these features mentioned, but I know from just looking at the storybook that there is some styling going on specifically for the forms, for example. This is an ID that I can look up in the code base and find verbatim. If I were to train a new developer if I were to mentor a developer into development, then I would want to use a repository like this one. If I wanted to start a new product and make sure that I can add developers incrementally of any skill level, then I would go with something like this, because there are discrete areas where I know that I can train somebody to interact with a subsection of the code base. For example, if I had a junior developer, I would direct them to the features folder and say, only work within this limited scope. And they'd be able to choose any one of these main entity categories and say that they're working on a specific behavior for the assets component in the admin panel, for example. Then I could say reasonably that during code review, I would expect that you only changed code in this folder. Then, as somebody with more experience with this repository, I can go through and see where their code can later be extracted or reworked into a more long-lasting solution, depending on how long we want that solution to last. And with this, I know that I can kind of expect all of these folders to have a relatively consistent structure. So if I see a type of file in a place that I wouldn't expect it, it's relatively easy for me to notice that and ask questions to make sure that that's what we want to do. It's different than this code base, where it is very difficult to know which things are supposed to be where they are and which things just happen to be that way. Similarly, with the actual functionality of the website, there are a lot of nuances to how this code base performs that just wouldn't be easy to describe. Like, I can say that this is how the code base behaves when you do certain things, but it doesn't really clarify. It's very hard for me to refer to the features of this website and the nuances behind them without sitting next to somebody and being able to walk through this code base with them. Now, those are two repositories. You can see the commit history. I see the oldest commit for the front-end code base, December 21st, and the oldest commit for D3 V7 is November 2nd. This is about a month and a half old. These commits are all verified. I don't know if these are. Yes, they are. Signed with GPG. So you know this came from me. This is code that I've written myself. These are fine and dandy. I can describe how a code base exists over time. This is a two-year-old repository with 256 commits. This is a 2-month-old repository with 165 commits. You can describe this to people as necessary and compare the approaches, describe the evolution, describe the shift in goals, the IDEs that I used even, because I started this one with Vim, then I switched to VS Code and then WebStorm. And I think that I was using WebStorm consistently for front-end code base. So trainability, I would say, are the main things that I like about these code bases. They aren't going to be perfect for every single use case, but at least in identifying why I would want to use one or the other, that's possible. And that's something that I appreciate. Now, for the future, the front-end code base repository is specifically designed, and I was very intentional about this earlier between, I want to say, I guess 8 months ago, 5 months ago. So I think that I was working on this for about 3 months consistently this year. There's this readme.swoop file, which I've gone ahead and plugged into ChatGPT, and then I can ask it specific questions about the code base and assume that there are going to be other README files in this code base, or at least comments that I can use to ask Copilot or whatever I'm using, whatever AI assistance I'm using to help me navigate this. And there is a consistent enough structure that I can reasonably ask AI questions about where I should put something, and it can give me a reasonable answer. Like even if I just had the file structure tree. And that's a little bit different than this new repository, a lot newer, that I just use to play around with Go, which is the language that I want to learn. So in this case, I have a game that I asked ChatGPT to move around with arrows, and it gave me a package to use and some of the code to start that. And I added my own square, and I changed the color of one of the squares. Originally, this was a repository that I used to create an animation. Let's see if I can open this. It takes an input image and then produces a video of various levels of animation with it. So that was the original purpose of the repository. I wanted to just play around with image editing. I did some things where I changed the color of pixels, and in this animation example, 26 frame rates or 26 frames per second. I'm just compositing a whole bunch of these pixelized images that I created in a loop. So that's that. This doesn't really say anything about my development skill. It shows that I have Go on my radar. It shows that I'm interested in keeping things fresh in terms of development. It shows that I have curiosity about the space, and reasonably, I can compile something from this repository as I continue to learn Go, where I could reasonably use WebAssembly as a compilation target and create an animation or some sort of interface to interact with what I'm doing on factshift.com. So in terms of summarizing the entire scope of what I've just described, I have two repositories that I would use in real life, one of them to scale a code base across teams and time, another to just get features out the door as quickly as possible, and then a third repository which describes how much fun I have with code and some of the stuff that's on my radar in that space. The next steps for me are to make sure that lore.land is polished. Right now, we're sitting at lore.land/button. This is installable as a progressive web app. There isn't anything on the main page of lore.land that would need to change. All of the other sites are down, like boon.land, bane.land, etc. Bone, bonk, honk, boof, and lore.land are all, except for lore, are all down. So that's the thing that I would want to flesh out. The concept behind these sites is that as people visit, they have the ability to interact with their own data. That's what I'm demonstrating here. How you can have a page and then refresh that page and have the data stay because you're using local storage. And you can yoink those nodes and save, refresh the page, go to a different one, another concept, and paste those in. Whoops. And those nodes are going to be there. So the idea behind the lore.land concept is that as you're going from site to site, you'd be able to copy your data, click this button, mutate your data, do whatever you want with it. And that's what I'm going to be fleshing out with this Go repository. So I think those are the main things. Eventually, I'd like to make a tutorial series where I specifically introduce people to how to start these projects from scratch. For now, I'm just going to point to the commit history and say that for the D3 V7 repository, I started with Vim, moved to VS Code, then to WebStorm. If you want to do something similar, I would recommend at least having the familiarity, the comfortability with a text editor to where you can start to, I guess, flesh that out. You know exactly what goes into this. You can describe to yourself how to interact with it enough to make a coherent concept you can interact with, and then flesh it out to something that's a bit more like this front-end code base. This is a 20-minute video. I don't think that most employers are going to watch this, so I'm probably not even going to edit the sound on this. Just upload it and go back through and make a shorter video where I talk about fewer things more concisely. Probably just give the TLDR that I recently gave about what these code bases are and how I would use them, kind of the radar of what I've been working on, so on and so forth. That's it for now.